Hello friends, welcome you all. In last class, we have seen the historical background of Constitution of India, that is Company Rule 1773 to 1858. In that, we have seen the Regulating Act of 1773 and the Important Act Pitt's India Act of 1784 and Charter Act of 1793 and then Charter Act of 1813, 1833 and finally we have seen 1853. So today we are going to see the Crown's rule, that is 1858 to 1947. So let us see one by one. So let us begin with the Government of India Act of 1858. So this act is significant. Why it is significant? This act is enacted in the wake of the revolt of 1857. This revolt is also famously called as First War of Independence. So this revolt is also called as Chipoy Mutiny. So this is important. And also this Government of India Act of 1858 is known as Act for the Good Government of India. Why it is Good Government of India? Since the British Crown abolished the East Indian Company and transferred the powers of government, territories, revenues to the British Crown. So from this act onwards, it everything came under Crown's rule. Let us see the important key features of this act. Here, it changed the designation of the Governor General of India to Viceroy of India. So, this is important related to the prelims, which means this Viceroy was the direct representative of the British Crown in India. According to that, Lord Canning becomes the first Viceroy of India. So these are all very important facts related to a Pilgrim's perspective. And also, this Government of India Act of 1858 ended the system of double government. This double government was introduced in Pitt's India Act of 1784. But this act ended that double government by abolishing the Court of Directors and Board of Control. And also, this act is important because it created a new office called as Secretary of State for India. And also, this Secretary of State for India vested with complete authority and control over Indian administration. Here, one has to note that the Secretary of State was the member of the British cabinet and also he was the responsible ultimately to the British Parliament. So this is also important. And one has to note that it established a 15-member council of India to assist the Secretary of State for India. This council was a advisory body. Here, the Secretary of State was made the chairman of this council, and also it constituted the Secretary of State in Council as a body corporate, which means capable of suing and being sued in India and also in England. However, this Act of 1580, I mean 15, 1858 was largely confined to the improvement of administrative machineries by which the Indian government was to be supervised and controlled in England, and also it does not alter any substantial way the system of government prevailed in India. So these are the important key facts related to Government of India Act 1858. And then, so here, according to which the Indian Council Act of 1861 was enacted. See, after the Great Revolt of 1857, that is Chipai Mutni, the British government felt that it is necessary and also seeking the cooperation of the Indians in the administration of their country, and also to pursue that the British Parliament enacted this Indian Council Acts 1861, 1892 and 1909. So these three are very important acts. So let us see the Indian Council Act of 1861. This is the important landmark in the constitutional and political history of India. Why? Let us see the key features so that one can able to understand why it is important landmark in with respect to constitutional and political history of India. So it made the beginning of the representative institutions by associating Indians with the lawmaking process, so that it plays very important. And and also it provided viceroy should nominate some Indians as non-official members of its expanded council. And also in 1862, Lord Canning, the viceroy, nominated three Indians to its legislative council, namely Raja of Benares and Maharaja of Patiala and Sir Dinkar Rao. They were nominated. These are the three Indians nominated in the Lord Canning Legislative Council. And also, this act initiated the process of decentralization, whereas during the company rule, it made centralized administration, starting with the Regulating Act of 1773, and also the final centralization was Charter Act of 1833. But here, Indian Council Act of 1861, it made the process of decentralization by restoring the legislative powers to the Bombay and Madras presidencies. So thus, it reversed the centralizing tendency and started from the Regulating Act of 1773, and a climax reached to Charter Act of 1833. So therefore, this is very important. And this Act 1861 created, that is provided the establishment of new legislative councils for Bengal and northwestern provinces and Punjab, which were established in 1862, 1886 and 1897 respectively. And also it empowers the viceroy to make rules and orders for the more convenient transaction of business in the council. So in the latest the president do, after the independence, the president doing thus convenient transaction business. So same way, during the British crown, the viceroy the makes the rule and order for more convenient transaction of business in the council. Also, one has to know that it gave the recognition to the portfolio system. So this is important related to your prelims. 1861 only gave the recognition to the portfolio system. This portfolio system was introduced by Lord Canning in 1859. So, under this, the member of the Viceroy Council was made in charge of one or more departments of the government, and also it authorized to issue final orders on behalf of the council on matter on his departments. Here, at present, after the independence, the president promulgate emergency situations, that is emergency provisions. So before, that is during the British crown, The Viceroy empowered to issue ordinance without the concurrence of Legislative Council, that is, during an emergency situations. So this ordinance was a life of 6 months, which means the life of such an ordinance was 6 months. So these are the important key features of Indian Council Act of 1861. And then the Indian Council Act of 1892. This is also important. Let us see the key features. Here, in this act, it increased the number of additional, in the sense, non-official members in the central and the provincial legislative councils. And also, one has to note that it maintained the official majority in them. So this is important. And also it increases the function of legislative council and gave them the power of discussing the budget and addressing the questions to the executive. Here one has to note the important point that there is no supplementary questions, which means a member can discuss the budget, address the question to the executive. The executive will respond. And the supplementary questions which cannot be followed, this is the drawback. And also it provided for the nomination of some non-official members, that is to the Central Legislative Council, called as Indian Legislative Council, by the Viceroy on the recommendations of the Provincial Legislative Council, and also Bengal Chamber of Commerce. These legislative and also the provincial legislative councils by the governors on the recommendation of the district board, municipalities, universities, trade associations, jamindars and chambers. Here this act, Indian Council of 1892, made a limited and indirect provisions for the use of election in filing up some of the non-official seats with respect to both central and provincial legislative councils. Here in this act, the word election was, however, not used in this act. So here that is very important. The word election was, however, not used. Whereas the process was described as nomination made on the recommendations on certain bodies. So these are the key important features related to Indian Council Act of 1892. So here this is very important, very important related to your prelims perspective. Let us begin. This act is very important. Why? Indian Council Act of 1909. This act famously called as Morley-Minto reforms, which means the Lord Morley was the Secretary of State for India and the Lord Minto was the Viceroy of India. What are the features? Let us see. It increases the size of legislative council in the both central and provincial. It is one of the most important key features. And also the number of members in the central legislative council was raised from 16 to 60, and then the number of members in the provincial legislative council was not uniform. Provincial legislative council was not uniform. This is important. Note, not the legislative council, which means not the central legislative council, but the provincial legislative council was not uniform. However, it retained official majority in the central legislative council but allowed provincial legislative council to have non-official majority, whereas in the central legislative council it retained the official majority. That is the major difference. And also it enlarged the deliberatory functions of the legislative councils at both the levels, central level and provincial level. So here that means the members were allowed to ask the supplementary questions and move resolution on the budget, etc. Whereas in the Indian Council Act of 1892, there budget was discussed, addressed the question to the executives, but there was no supplementary questions. But in this act 1909, you can, I mean, the members can allowed to ask the supplementary questions, and also they can move a resolution on the budget, etc. This is the very important related to 1909. And also it provided for the first time the association of Indians with the Executive Council of Viceroys and Governors, by which the Satyendra Prasad Singha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council. Kindly note that it is important related to prelims. Satyendra Prasad Singha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy Executive Council. He was appointed as the law member. That is also important. So this next point is very very important. Let us see, since you have to know the difference in the upcoming acts. Here it introduced the system of communal representations for Muslims. Note the word communal representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorate, which means the Indian Council Act of 1909 introduced the concept of separate electorate, and also it provided communal representations for Muslims. Under this, the Muslim members were to be elected only by the Muslim voters. Also, this act is called as legalized communalism. This is important point. The Lord Minto came to be known as father of communal the communal representation, or else the communal electorate. This is important. One has to remember those points. And also, this act provided for the separate representation of presidency corporations, chamber of commerces, and universities, and jamindaris. So these are the important facts one has to remember and keep in mind while revising and also while go throughing. So let us move on with the Government of India Act 1919. This is famous act, and why it is famous, let us see. On August 20, 1917, in history, modern history, you will find it briefly. Anyhow, we will see. The British government declared for the first time, kindly note, first time, that objective was the gradual introduction of responsible government in India. Note the word responsible government in India. That is the first time British government declared this word, introduction of responsible government in India. According to which the Government of India Act of 1919 thus enacted came into force in 1921. This act famously called as Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, whereas the first name always describes the Secretary of State, which means the Montagu was the Secretary of State for India. The Lord Chelmsford was the Viceroy of India. So let us see the key features related to this act. This act relaxed the central control over the provinces by democrating and separating the central and provincial subjects. So at present, that is union list, concurrent list, state list, so like that. Those days, the central and provincial legislature were authorized to make laws on their respective list of subjects. However, The structure of the government continued to be centralized and unitary. What do you mean by unitary? All the powers belongs to the central legislative council, not the provincial. That is called as unitary. Further, it divided the provincial subject into two parts: transfer subject and reserve subject. This is famously called as a diarchy. The word diarchy was first time introduced in the Government of India Act of 1919. This is important, which means the transfer subject were to be administered by the governor with the aid of the ministers responsible to the legislative council, whereas the reserve subjects were to be administered by the governor and his executive council without being responsible to the legislative council. So this dual scheme of governance famously called as diarchy. This diarchy was derived from the Greek word. What does it mean? Double rule. So that is called as diarchy. However, this diarchy experiment largely unsuccessful, but it was introduced during the Government of India Act of 1919. And also this act introduced for the first time bicameralism. What do you mean by bicameralism? The upper house and the lower house. That is mean by bicameralism. And also direct elections, first time introduced in the country by the Government India Act of 1919. So thus, the Indian Legislative Council was replaced by a bicameral legislation. So consisting of upper house in the sense Council of States, and a lower house. The lower house called as Legislative Assembly. So the majority of the member of both the houses were chosen by the direct election. Here, the direct election was introduced first time, and also it required the three of the six members of the Viceroy Executive Council, other than the chief in commander in chief, were to be Indian. So note that three of six members of Viceroy Executive Council were to be Indian, other than the commander in chief. And also, it extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates to Sikhs, Indians, Christians, Anglo Indians, and Europeans. Kindly note the difference. In the Act of 1909, it introduced for the Muslims. In 1919, it introduced for, which means it extended for Sikhs, Indians, Christians, Anglo Indians, and Europeans. These are the differences one has to note while studying. And also, it granted the franchise to a limited numbers of people on the basics of property, tax, or education. Here, this is very important. It's created a new office of the High Commissioner for India in London. This is important. Why? It transferred to him some of the functions performed by the Secretary of State for India, which means this High Commissioner for India in London has some functions which was performed by the Secretary of State for India. First time this new office was created in London. And also, it established the Public Service Commission. Present day, we call it as Union Public Service Commission. In those days, it called it as Central Public Service Commission. So, which was set up in 1926 for recruiting civil servants. And also, note that it is for Central Public Service Commission. And also, it separated for the first time provincial budgets from the central budget. This is also important related to your prelims perspective. First time, the provincial budgets from the central budgets was separated. And also, it authorized the provincial legislature to enact their budgets. Here in this act, the appointment of statutory commission to inquire into and report on its working after 10 years. of its commands coming into the force. According to that, the Simon Commission was formed and also communal representation. So these two things we will discuss during the modern India period. So let us see the Government of India Act of 1935. Here in this slide also I have given you few important points related to 1919. So kindly go through that. This is important point which we have already discussed. Kindly go through and then let us move on with the Government of India Act of 1935. This is important. This act marked a second milestone towards the complete responsible government in India. Whereas in 1919, that was the first step. British announced that the responsible government in India. Whereas in this Government of India Act of 1935, the complete responsibility in India. Those are the differences one has to note during your preparation. Here, this Government of India Act of 1935 was important. Why? Let us see. It was the lengthy and also it contains a documents having 321 sessions and 10 schedules. So present day we are call it as a articles. 395 articles present day. In the Government of India Act of 1935, there was 321 sections, that is 321 articles and 10 schedules. Let us see the important facts related to Government of India Act of 1935. It provided for establishment of All India Federation. This is the key word. Kindly note down. All India Federation consisting of provinces and princely states as units. And also this act divided the powers between the center and the units in terms of three lists, present day and those days. Federal list for center with 59 items, provincial list and then 54 items, concurrent list with 36 items. Right now it has been changed. Kindly note down that also. Here, after these list, the remaining powers, which is called as residue powers, were to be given to the governor, that is Viceroy. However, the federation never came into being as the princely state did not join it. This is important. Did not join it. And also, this act famous. Why? It abolished diarchy, which was introduced in the Act of 1919. Here it abolished diarchy in the provinces and introduced the word provincial autonomy in these plates. This is important. Note down while go through provincial autonomy. This is important related to Pilgrim's perspective. The provinces were allowed to act as autonomous, and also the act introduced responsible governments in provinces, which means the governor was required to act with the advice of the ministers responsible to the provincial legislator. And also, this act came into effect in 1937. This act discontinued, which means this provincial autonomy discontinued in 1939. Here, this is important. It provided for the first time adoption of diarchy at the center, whereas in 1919 diarchy was introduced for the provinces. Here in 1935 the adoption of diarchy at the center. So according to that, the federal subjects were divided into reserve subjects and transfer subjects. However, this provision of the act did not came into operation at all. And one has to note the important point. Here, it introduced the bicameralism in 6 states out of 11 provinces. Let us see. that is legislative of Bengal, Bombay, Madras, Bihar, Assam, and United Provinces were made bicameralism, which means upper house and lower house. And also, it has some restrictions. Here, in this act, further extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for depressed class. What do you mean by depressed class? After communal representation in 1932, that we will see in the modern history, let us see that this depressed class, that is scheduled class, women and labor workers. So these are the important points one has to remember. In 1909, it is introduced for Muslims, and 1919 it introduced for remaining. Here it is introduced for depressed classes, women and laborers. These are the differences one has to note down while preparing. Here it abolished the Council of India, which means it by established the Government of India Act of 1858, and the Secretary of State for India was provided with the team of advisors. Here one has to know that it extended the franchisee. About 10% of the population got the voting right. And also, this is important. Why it is important? Let us see. This act provided for the establishment of Reserve Bank of India to control the currency and the credit of the country. But if you go through the RBI website, you will find the different history of Reserve Bank of India. But in the constitution, it has provided that this establishment of Reserve Bank of India under the Government India Act of 1935. So that is different. Let us see the next point. It provided for the establishment of not only Federal Service Commission, and also introduced the Provincial Public Service Commission, which means a State Public Service Commission, present day State Public Service Commission. And also it introduced the Joint Public Service Commission for 2 or more provinces. And also it provided for the establishment of Federal Court, which was set up in 1937. One has to remember it is different from the Regulating Act of 1773. In that act, it was established the Supreme Court, whereas here it has established the Federal Court. So these are the differences one has to remember. So let us begin with the Indian Independence Act of 1947. Here on February 1947, the British Prime Minister Attlee declared that the British rule in India would end by June 30, 1948, after which the powers would be transferred to responsible Indian hands. These announcements was followed by the agitations by the Muslim leagues. Why there is an agitation? Because this Muslim League demanding partition of the country. So again, the British government made it clear that any constitution framed by the Constitution Assembly of India, formed in 1946, cannot apply to the parts of the country which were unwilling to accept it. According to that, on the same day, the Lord Mountbatten, the Viceroy of India, put forward the partition plan known as Mountbatten Plan. This is important. Here, this plan was accepted by the Congress and the Muslim leagues. According to that, the immediate effect was given to the plan by enacting the Indian Independence Act of 1947. Let us discuss the key features. So, this act ended the British rule in India and declared India as an independent and a sovereign state from August 15, 1947. And also it provided for the partition of India and creation of 2 independent dominions of India and Pakistan with the right to cede from the British Commonwealth. And also it abolished the office of Viceroy and provided for Dominion, that is Governor General, who was being appointed by the British Crown on the advice of the Dominion Cabinet. And also there was no responsibility with respect to the government of India or Pakistan. And also, it empowered the constitutional assemblies of the two dominants to frame and adapt their constitutions, and they can repeal any act of the British Parliament, including the Independence Act itself. That is important, including the Independent Act itself. And also, it empowered the Constituent Assembly of both the dominants to legislate respective territories till new constitution were framed and enforced. So these are the important points. And so no act of the British Parliament passed after the August 15, 1947 was to be extended to either of the new dominants, that is Pakistan or India, unless it was extended thereby a law of the legislator of their respective dominants. And also note that it abolishes the office of the Secretary of the State for India and transferred its functions to the Secretary of State for Commonwealth Affairs. Also, this is important point related to prelims. It proclaimed the lapse of British paramountcy over the Indian princely states and treaty relations with the tribal areas from August 15, 1947. And also, it granted freedom to the Indian princely states, which means either to join the dominion of a Indian or dominion of Pakistan according to their wish. They either can join in India or Pakistan or remain independent. But it provided for the governance of each of the dominants and provinces by the Government of India Act of 1935 till the new constitution were framed. And according to that, the dominants were, however, authorized to make modifications in the act. And also, it deprived the British monarch of its right to veto bills and ask for certain reservations of the bills for its approval. Those things were deprived from the British monarchs. And also, it designated the Governor General of India and provincial governors as the nominal head of the states. And also, it dropped the title of Emperor of India from the royalty titles of King of England. So these are the important points one has to remember. So according to that, in the midnight of 15 August 1947, the British rule came to an end and power was transferred to the two independent dominants, that is India and Pakistan, by which Lord Mountbatten became the first Governor General of the new Dominion of India. Note that after 1947, Lord Mountbatten became the first Governor General of the new Dominion of India. This Lord Mountbatten made Jawaharlal Nehru as the first Prime Minister of India, of independent India. Jawaharlal Nehru sworn in as first Prime Minister of independent India, and also the Constitution of Assembly formed in 1946 became the Parliament of the Indian Dominion. So one has to note these things while go through. So these are the points very important related to the prelims perspective. Kindly go through. Thanks for being with this discussion. Let us see in the next video. Have a good day. Thank you.